Welcome to Section 4 of Learning Knockout.JS. In the last section, we looked at two-way data binding. In this section, we're going to examine the concept of context in Knockout.JS. Context is central to the MVVM pattern and data binding, so it's important to understand it if you're going to take full advantage of the pattern. We'll take a look at the commonly used context objects in Knockout. We'll also look at templates and how context is used when data binding them. And we'll cover an important object-oriented concept known as composition and how we can combine multiple view models in a single view model and view. In this video, we'll use the foreach binding again, but we'll go a little farther this time and discuss specifically the role of context when using this binding. Then we'll introduce the with binding and demonstrate how context is important when binding with it. The root context object is used quite frequently, so we'll cover its use, and we'll also look at the element context object, which can be useful at times. To start, open our project and add a new HTML page named foreach.html to the root of the project, and a new JavaScript file named foreachViewModel in the View Models folder under Scripts. Go ahead and insert our boilerplate revealing module code in the script file, and set up the HTML page with the necessary references. And of course, go ahead and set up our initialization code so that we can bind our view model to our view. For this demo, we're going to need some data that's a little more complex than what we've been working with. So let's create a property in our view model that represents some products and the colors in which they're available. In the view, let's display the array of products in an unordered list and the colors per product in an embedded unordered list. To data bind our array, we'll use the foreach binding like we did in previous videos, only this time we'll use explicitly the full chain of context objects available in Knockout.JS. In the outermost unordered list, insert a data bind attribute and set up the foreach binding. The current binding context is simply called $context. It represents the setting in which our data is accessed. In this case, the context is the setting in which our view model resides. Like we saw in a previous video, context has data, and you can access that data using the $data context object. In this instance, data refers to the view model itself. To complete this statement, we can access the products property off of the $data context object. Of course, as we saw in previous videos, we can bypass the $context and $data context objects and go straight for the property. The context objects are simply implied. We can data bind the h4 element in a similar fashion. Here, the $context object refers to the individual element in the products array. Its context has $data as well, and it refers to the properties and methods included in the array item. Here, we'll access the name property. Here's what it looks like thus far in the browser. There's a special context object that's only available within the foreach binding. It's called the $index context object, and it represents a zero-based index of the current array entry. If we add this object to our text binding, you'll see that each item that's output is numbered, starting at 0. Note that because we're evaluating the $index context object as part of a string concatenation, we need to call it using parentheses so that we can get to the value of its observable. Otherwise, we could just reference it without the parentheses. Data binding our colors property from the current context is the same as accessing the name property, only now we're creating a new context within this foreach binding, a context that contains each individual array of strings for each of our product's colors. At this point in our code, we have three distinct contexts. The view model's context, which is bound to the page by using the apply bindings method, the outermost unordered list, which is established by the foreach binding on our products property, and the innermost unordered list, which is created by the foreach binding on the colors property of each product. Each of them have their own $context object, which can have its own $data context object. We can see in the browser that each level of foreach bindings has its own $index context object that's independent of the others. We can access the parent context of any given context too, except the root context, of course. Knockout provides us with the $parent context object, which is the immediately preceding context in the hierarchy. Here, we can output the $index context object of the outermost unordered list within the innermost unordered list. Now let's move on to our next binding. The with binding in Knockout.JS establishes a new binding context so that child elements are bound within the context of the specified object. To demonstrate this, create a new HTML page named with.html and a view model named withViewModel.js with the appropriate references and boilerplate code. We'll use animal taxonomy for this demo because it's a fairly familiar hierarchical set of data. In our view model, we'll add a public property named taxonomies and populate it with some sample object literals. In our view, we'll use Knockout's virtual element syntax to create a loop over our taxonomies objects. We'll add a div element here and use the with binding, which will create a new binding context specific to the animal classification. Anything bound within this div element is in the context of that object. If we add another div element inside the animal div element, we'll see that the properties we're limited to are the name and kingdom property, which is on the next object down the chain. We can continue this until we reach the bottom of the hierarchy. Now comes the fun part. We're going to output each level's name property from within the innermost context. We can do this by accessing the $parentContext object, which is an array of all the context objects in the hierarchy. The array starts at 0, which is the next closest parent context. In this case, the $parent or $parents subscript 0 would be the genus object. If we were to go all the way down to the first object in the hierarchy, we would be accessing $parents subscript 6. Incidentally, I included the name of the classification in each element just for reference. The text binding will overwrite the value. At this point, we're way down in a long hierarchy of objects, but what if we wanted to access a method in the view model? That's where the $root object context comes in handy. The $root context is the topmost parent context, which, in our case, is the withViewModel revealing module. Let's add a public method in our view model to display the entire object. We'll pass the animal object and format a message for a JavaScript alert. To trigger the method, we'll use a click binding on the h1 element. The click binding by default sends the current data object and the event object. We need to pass the $parent subscript 6 object though, which presents a problem. We can solve this dilemma by wrapping the call to our viewModel's method in another function and passing our context object. When we click on one of the h1 elements, we get an alert that shows each level of the object hierarchy. The last item we'll look at is the $element context object. This object represents the DOM element of the current binding. To demonstrate how it works, we'll add another public method to our view model, which will accept an HTML element and use a JavaScript alert to display its inner text. In our view, we'll assign a function to our click binding, and from within that function, we'll call our display method and pass it the $element context. And let's copy that and put it on our other elements. When we click on the elements, the inner text is displayed. Very cool. Context is a concept that is a little tricky to understand at first. We'll continue to use the various context objects throughout the rest of the videos, so if you're still having trouble, hang in there. It'll make sense with a little practice. In the next video, we'll introduce templating and binding to templates with Knockout.JS. Templates also create their own binding context, so we'll continue learning about context.